G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning community. My name's Luke Rowe, I'm a university lecturer and learning scientist, and in today's episode we're going to be looking at this idea of the research-practice divide and how to bridge that divide. We're going to consider why the gap exists in the first place, so some of the causes of that research-practice divide, and then of course the most powerful aspect of this episode is going to be what we can do about it. What can we do to bridge the gap between research and practice? So let's go. So what is this research-practice divide that we speak of? Well, according to one review by Chi, thousands of studies have been carried out by scholars in the cognitive, education and learning sciences relevant to how students learn. However, the findings from these studies have not trickled down to classroom implementations by practitioners and teachers in both the K-12 grades and the post-secondary year levels. This gap, referring to the lack of tangible impact of educational research knowledge in the classrooms, has been recognised for decades among researchers, practitioners and funders. So according to Chi, the research-practice divide boils down to a lack of tangible impact between the knowledge that's being generated by researchers and the classroom that it's supposed to influence but doesn't seem to be having an impact on. But it's not the only place where that research-practice gap exists. Of course, it's also in how we train educators in the first place. So let's have a deeper look into this issue. In a report for the National Council for Teacher Quality, Pomerantz and colleagues used 6 different strategies from the learning sciences as the basis for a textbook analysis in teacher education programs across the United States. These strategies included pairing graphics with words, linking abstract concepts with concrete representations, posing probing questions, repeatedly alternating solved and unsolved problems, distributing practice, otherwise known as spaced practice, and assessing to boost retention, that is assessment for learning, not just of learning. So what were the results of their review? They said that most teacher training programs in the USA failed to adequately cover robust evidence-based pedagogies and learning practices. Most teacher texts contained little to no mention of evidence at all, and 15% of the 48 texts that they used in the analysis contained 1 page or more on the 6 fundamental strategies supported by strong evidence. The texts instead devoted masses of content to storytelling, anecdotal and dubious evidence. So we're starting to see a pattern here of where this problem might come about because it's happening in teacher education programs right across the world, where we're not seeing evidence trickle down into those very institutes that pride themselves on the notion of higher education. So let's continue looking at just how ubiquitous this problem is. Another study by Surma and colleagues in 2018 encountered a similar issue. They analysed the topic coverage of 2 highly effective learning strategies, distributed practice and retrieval practice. They looked at how prevalent those 2 strategies were in materials representing 83% of Flemish and Dutch teacher education programs. Of the 136 textbooks and syllabi documents that they used to substantiate those programs, they found that 21% provided full coverage of distributed practice, so only 1 in 5. 2/3 had no mention of distributed practice at all. 84% failed to refer to retrieval practice at all. 3 of 24 programs provided an evidence-based account of distributed practice, and 6 of 24 did so for the notion of retrieval practice. So again, we're seeing some common themes here in teacher education programs across the world where evidence is distinctly missing from the syllabus and the training methods that we use to educate educators. Now, some might object to the idea that the teacher education syllabus documents and what's written in the textbooks is not reflective of reality, that it doesn't necessarily reflect teacher practice. Now, if that were the case, that it was simply the evidence is missing from the textbook documents or the syllabi documents, well then you'd probably reason that there would be evidence translating into professional practice when those teacher education programs sent the teachers out into the workforce. However, that's not what we see at all. We see the trends continue right from their training right through the professional workforce. Let's have a look at another study by Lysenko and colleagues in 2014. So in this study, the aim was to gather information on the barriers and enablers of research in educational practice. They used a 43-item questionnaire and they gave it to nearly 2,000 teachers, so quite a big study, big sample, 125 school administrators and leaders, and around 321 professional staff from 66 public secondary schools across Canada. So quite a big sample, big study there. Now what did they find? Well, the overall headline result was that the uptake of evidence was extremely low in practice, with most teachers reporting having only used evidence to inform their practice once or twice in the previous year. They also found that websites were the most common source of evidence, hence the inspiration for doing things like this channel. And the most common reason for the use of evidence was to improve professional practice. Now, teachers rated their awareness of research slightly higher if the results were accompanied by clear and explicit recommendations or based on discussions that were research-based information with colleagues. So, of course, if our colleague endorses a research-informed practice, we're far more likely to adopt that ourselves because it's coming from a credible source. The other point is that if you see your colleagues enacting evidence in practice, you've now got a worked example. We know from the learning sciences, worked examples are really powerful ways for us to learn. So the more of it there is, the more of it there is. And we see this in the practitioner context. Now, I remember reading a conversation article a couple of years ago that really grabbed my attention because it said only 1 in 3 teachers use research evidence in the classroom. So I dug a little bit deeper, and this, of course, was based on research conducted by the Q project at Monash University with their School of Education there. In that article, it said 1 in 3 teachers, or 33%, indicated they consulted research before the start of the school year, and 1 in 4, or 25%, did so during the holidays and between terms. So we notice a distinct pattern there that teachers aren't getting enough time to access and interpret and implement the evidence during their practicing terms. They're doing it in their own time in the school holidays, and they're not doing it very often because of that. Now, in a more recent report from the same research group, that is the researchers in the School of Education at Monash University's Q project, they actually updated their results and they were slightly more encouraging. Let's take a look. They said accessing research and evidence is a regular task for educators. So this is worth paying attention to the distinction between accessing evidence and implementing evidence. So notice the wording there. And the majority of educators use research at least every month. So they access it regularly and they use it every month, so less regularly. Now, accessing new research regularly is associated with more frequent use of research. Now, you might be listening and thinking, why state something so bleedingly obvious? Well, because it has powerful implications. It means if we give teachers and educators the time to access and interpret evidence, they're far more likely to implement it in practice. Now, when we discuss this idea of a research-practice divide, one of the common rabbit holes that we can go down is based around this topic of neuromyths. So let's take a closer look at this idea of neuromyths. According to MacDonald and colleagues, neuromyths are misconceptions about brain research, in other words neuroscience, and its application to education and learning. Now, there are some reviews out there in the literature, such as Goswami in 2006, that suggest that neuromyths are rife among educators. However, a more recent study by Kelly MacDonald and colleagues at the University of Houston showed that teachers are less likely to believe in neuromyths compared to the general population. And that suggests to me that expertise in educators acts as somewhat of a safeguard against false beliefs such as neuromyths. Her team concluded that the general public endorsed the greatest number of neuromyths at 68%, with significantly fewer endorsed by educators at 56%. So we've got a 12% difference, quite a significant result, and still fewer endorsed by the high neuroscience exposure groups, such as those who have to study neuroscience formally in their education, where they learn about the structure and function of the brain. Now, the 2 most commonly endorsed neuromyths across all groups were related to learning styles and dyslexia. So learning styles are typically represented in the VARK model, so the visual, auditory, reading and kinesthetic models. And apparently if you've got a preference for one of those types of learning, say visual, if you're a visual learner, apparently you prefer pictures as opposed to words or spoken words or read words. So we know from the literature that that's not true. There are things like the superiority effect, dual processing and dual coding theory that absolutely contradict that. The other thing is they talked about this idea of dyslexia, where teachers believe that dyslexia, a common sign and symptom of dyslexia, is reading words backwards or seeing letters backwards or writing them backwards. That's not necessarily true. This is a developmental thing that we see in many, many children, both dyslexic and not dyslexic. We also see, though, in dyslexic children, one of the earliest signs is that they suffer from a reduced phonemic and phonological awareness. So decoding words and being able to break them down, the sounds and the meaning and the look of the words down in their constituent elements. I know you're going to have to contain your excitement for this one because it's quiz time. We're going to be asking you 12 different neuromyth questions. So the idea of this is when you see these 12 questions up on screen, there are some neuromyths nested, hidden inside those 12 questions. Your job is to find out which ones are false, which are the neuromyths. All right, so I'm going to put them on screen, and this is from a publication by Decker and colleagues in 2012. So those questions were used in some of the teacher education program research, as well as general public misunderstandings about the brain and neuroscience. So here we go. You ready? Here are the questions. I'll give you a moment to read them. Feel free to pause the screen and write down your answers. So how did you go on that activity? Did you get 12 out of 12? Or were you like the remainder of the population who struggles with that, where we saw in the McDonald study that about 68% of the neuromyths presented were endorsed by those who responded to the questions? Stay tuned because we're going to reveal the answers towards the end of this video. But for now, we want to raise a bigger question. Are neuromyths really just a so what issue, or do they have real implications for the classroom? Let's take a look. Well, one study that had a look into this issue was by my old colleagues at the Science of Learning Research Centre, and there was a project led by Dr. Jared Cooney-Horvath, and they looked into this idea of neuromyths being irrelevant or relevant for award-winning versus non-award-winning teachers. So the question was, how did they implicate practice, if at all? And then was there differences between how the neuromyths, the endorsement of neuromyths implicated practice for award-winning teachers and non-award-winning teachers, and comparing and contrasting those outcomes there. So let's take a deeper look. And one of the fascinating things about their study was that they concluded that neuromyths are basically nothing burgers. Let me read the result. Results revealed the acceptance of neuromyths to be nearly identical between these two groups, that is award-winning and non-award-winning teachers, with the only difference occurring on 2 out of 15 items. These findings suggest that one cannot make simple, unqualified arguments concerning the relationship between belief in neuromyths and teacher effectiveness. In fact, the idea that neuromyths negatively impact upon teaching might itself be a neuromyth. Wow, what an inception moment where we've got a dream within a dream. We're starting to see this idea emerge that neuromyths may themselves be neuromyths in the sense that we believe them to implicate practice, for better or worse, in education, when in fact they may not have any implications at all. So, do you actually agree with Dr. Cooney-Horvath's conclusions? Or is there something more to it? Now, my personal opinion is that there is more research that needs to be done to establish a firm link between beliefs in the neuromyths and how they impact practice, whether they even implicate behaviour at all or not. Now, the reason I think that is because when I think about some of the neuromyths, say, for example, the VARK neuromyth, the visual, auditory, reading and kinesthetic models of learning styles, yeah, that definitely implicates practice because we know from the research that many teachers are using the learning styles categories to differentiate their practice. And it's obviously leading the teachers to spend time and the students to spend time trying to match their learning style or their learning preference with the mode of delivery of content in their syllabus. And it's a waste of time. It's not adding to their learning whatsoever. So yeah, there's an opportunity cost to that. Even if it's not directly harmful to the student per se, they could be doing something much more productive with their time. So yeah, there's a detrimental effect from that belief in learning styles. But then when I think of other things like, does your brain shut down overnight when you go to sleep, which of course is not true, it's always active, well, that's a seemingly benign neuromyth. How is that going to implicate practice? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it depends on the type of neuromyth that teachers believe in as to whether it's going to implicate practice. So more research really needs to be done at that level of specificity around the beliefs around neuromyths and the behaviours of educators. Okay, so let's step back and give a quick recap. We looked at this idea of what the research-practice divide is, which is essentially a mismatch between what the research evidence suggests is the best way to proceed in practice and how teachers and educators are actually performing, what they're actually doing. And we see the beginning of this research-practice divide emerging in the initial teacher education programs across the world and spanning right through to the professional careers of experienced educators. The next thing we're going to look at is why the research-practice divide exists in the first place, because that's going to help us understand how to implement a solution. In the same review that I quoted from earlier, Chi suggested that the 4 primary reasons for the research-practice divide are that the research is too theoretical, irrelevant to classrooms, inaccessible to teachers, and teachers lack the time to both access, interpret, and implement that evidence in practice. And of course, the idea of the irrelevance of evidence has been highlighted in many other reports, such as this evaluation of the progress of evidence implementation in England, where they found that evidence is influential only to the extent that it is deemed relevant to the teachers, to the classroom, to the context that they're in. In another review by myself and John Hattie, we made this argument. We argued that as a community of learning scientists, we have often missed the mark when it comes to educating educators. We suggest that much of this is because the science of learning research community has failed to develop a self-referential body of knowledge. So what do I mean by that? Basically, I'm saying that the big missed opportunity here is that we as learning scientists aren't even looking to the learning sciences to help educate educators and teachers on how to implement evidence in the classroom. So it's not a self-referential body of knowledge yet, and we've got to be taking the very lessons that we are so willing to talk about and implementing those in a modelled, embodied format. Otherwise, people are going to look at learning scientists and see that they're walking contradictions. Right? And so I'm trying to involve that in what I'm doing here on YouTube, but also across my teaching whenever I am teaching in front of a lecture theatre or whether I'm teaching in a tutorial. Then we looked into some of the barriers and the enablers of implementing evidence in the classroom. We found 4 different themes. There were objections around personal beliefs, such as issues with measurement and data and the belief that that doesn't necessarily entail the best form of learning or that it's even worthwhile in the first place. There were objections based on gaps in knowledge and skills, such as teachers missing out on being educated about the research in the first place in their education programs. There were objections based on systemic barriers, such as schools not having the resources or even the access to the evidence, which is a big problem. Then there were objections based on concerns about the quality of evidence, which I certainly share and sympathise with those objections, because a lot of educational research has got as many problems as we see in other fields. So replication's an issue, small sample sizes are very much an issue. We've also got a lot of confounds in the messy, noisy space of a classroom. So of course these are all valid objections, but it doesn't mean this is an insurmountable problem. Another study by Decker and Mita published in 2022 argued that there are 3 different categories of objections to evidence-based education: epistemic, socioeconomic, and normative. They said that the objections from an epistemic perspective are when they target methodological questions or assumptions and consequences at the level of philosophy of science, such as when do we know what causes what, for example. Socioeconomic objections, which target the feasibility or repercussions of the evidence-based education paradigm. And finally, the normative objections are those which are ethical by nature and object to the purpose or lack thereof of evidence-based education. Another intriguing explanation is the Semmelweis reflex, and I read about this in a book here, How Learning Happens by Kirschner and Hendrick in 2020. And they talked about this idea of a reflex-like tendency to reject new evidence or new knowledge because it contradicts established norms, beliefs, or paradigms. So as we know, old paradigms die hard and people often resist change. That's human nature. That's not unique to educators. So we can't pick on educators in any way. But change comes in small increments in these times. A similar explanation is the boomerang effect, which suggests that attempts to change attitudes in the direction advocated by communication on a social issue at times produce shifts in the direction opposite to that intended. And these kinds of explanations have had a bit of a resurgence lately, including in this study by Tom and colleagues, who looked at pre-service teachers and how they engage in this idea that they describe as knowledge discounting. They describe that as when a teacher is faced with strong belief discrepant scientific evidence that is hard to dismiss, they'll tend to resist the evidence by concluding that the topic of study is not amenable to scientific investigation. Now, when they researched this in pre-service teachers or teachers in their undergoing their education program, they found this. Pre-service teachers devalued educational research and its sources when scientific evidence conflicted with their prior belief. So obviously when we start to look at how beliefs implicate behaviours, it's a very complex space. Let's continue looking into some of the research. The late and great Professor Bob Slavin was a pioneer in this area on evidence-based reform in education. He looked at this from a macro policy development perspective, as well as the micro level implementation issues. So at the bigger picture level, at the policy level, he looked at politics, finances, and prevailing traditions as becoming barriers or enablers for evidence-based education. Then he saw 7 smaller obstacles, so lack of implementation fidelity when translating evidence to practice, low generalizability of findings, using averages to hide important trends among subgroups, low replicability, over-reliance on expensive resources for successful implementation, transient effects that dissipate with time, and blindly privileging experimental over other forms of evidence. So I wonder if you can relate to some of those issues in your practice. Do you have some of those systemic barriers or even personal barriers to the implementation of evidence in your practice? Now, one of the things I'm doing for my personal research is developing a database of all of the objections to evidence-based education. So I've got 21 up on screen. I'll put them there. I've color-coded them, but I'd love to hear if you've got any other ideas about objections to evidence in education, because what I hope to do at some point in the future is not only write a research paper about this, but build a video around it so that I can steelman the objections and then give my best response to those, so that can be a kind of dialogical enterprise there. So if you're interested in that, please put your ideas in the comments section. Now we finally got to the best bit. We've talked about the problem of the research-practice divide, but what is the solution? How can we build a bridge across that gap? Well, in order to understand how to do that, we first must understand this idea of implementation science. So what is implementation science? Well, according to Eccles and Mittman, implementation science is the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practice into routine practice, and hence to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services. Now, of course, this same kind of explanation about implementation science can be grafted into the educational context. And it's very relevant as far as I'm concerned, because we're dealing with the same issues of bringing evidence from the laboratory into the classroom. So why is this idea of implementation science so important? Well, in a paper by Bauer and Kirschner, they point out 3 different reasons. They've said establishing effectiveness of an innovation does not guarantee its uptake in routine usage. So that's reason number 1. There's no guarantees that establishing the evidence effectiveness is going to lead to a routine usage in that evidence. Reason number 2, classic studies indicate that it takes 17 to 20 years to get clinical innovations into practice. Moreover, fewer than 50% of clinical innovations ever make it into general usage. So the best intentions of researchers very rarely land in the classroom. The third point they make is that ample experience indicates that factors which affect the uptake of a clinical innovation differ from those factors that determine whether an innovation works. So you could have research that shows incredible results, that it's high quality research replicated the world over, but at the same time, once you put it into practice, there are unintended consequences or unforeseen barriers or confounds to that evidence in practice that make it fall flat. So you would have seen in the last video this 5-step evidence-based teaching cycle that I promoted. It's got these 5 parts that if we do well, we should have successful implementation of evidence. But if any one of these things goes wrong, it's like a broken link on a chain. And in this case, in the context of implementation science, what we're saying is we could have a great purpose, excellent quality, the interpretation is faithful to the research, and yet the implementation goes wrong, and so the whole thing collapses. And when you go to evaluate the impact of your intervention, it's going to show that there wasn't any impact there. And you then have to ask yourself the question, was it because the research intervention was ineffective, or was it because my implementation of it was ineffective? And so this is a big issue for those of us who want to bring evidence into our educational practice. So let's get a little bit deeper into this field of implementation science and see what kinds of clues it can give us to drive evidence uptake in our educational and learning environments. Now, if you want to discover some of the best work in this field, you cannot look past Sandra Nutley. Her classic book in 2007, Using Evidence, described a couple of major evaluations of the uptake of evidence in educational settings. Here are some of the results from her research. They looked at 160 diverse educational interventions and found that 65% successfully changed practice, and that increased to 80% when 3 or more interventions were combined. So not as dire straits as we saw in the medical and healthcare setting before. Passive and didactic approaches had no effect. Right? So this is speaking to that point around needing to use the principles of the science of learning to teach teachers about the science of learning. So let's focus on the other points she made. Interventions of 1 day or less had no effect, which is probably the most common form of professional development and learning, less than a day. It's usually an hour or 2. Ongoing and interactive partnerships help promote the evidence uptake. And opinion leaders such as school principals, assistant principals, and lead teachers, if they're heavily influenced and persuaded by the evidence, then that's going to help increase the uptake amongst the other staff members and other teaching body at the school or the educational institute. They also said the effect of the evidence increased with the technical, emotional, and organizational supports being implemented alongside them. And finally, the evidence was more effective when there were reminders and incentives to use evidence-based practice. In a more recent publication by Sandra Nutley, she wrote this about the current state of evidence-based practice. She said, to improve the use of evidence in schools, we must ensure that definitions of good evidence are fit for purpose, developing inclusive processes that enable evidence to be integrated with other forms of knowledge and ways of knowing, doing more than improving the supply of evidence by building relationships and systems that support evidence use and ensuring sustainable funding models for evidence use initiatives that have been shown to be effective. And that speaks to a wider point that too often we see in the media the blame, just as the conversation article that I discussed before, is often put squarely on individuals, on individual teachers. And now that's easy to do as a society, to blame everything on the teachers. But of course the problem is a systemic problem, and often it's got to do with funding and time. It's as basic as that in some instances. So throwing more funds and time and expertise at these things can actually work. So we need to rally for that. Now, in the study that we looked at earlier by Lysenko, they also found some clues about what promoted the uptake of evidence in schools. Let's have a look at that. They suggested that the number one thing was developing positive attitudes towards evidence, building expertise in the use of evidence, increasing awareness and accessibility of evidence, and creating an organizational culture in support of evidence-based practice. So not too many surprises there. Let's look at another study by Decker and Mita in 2022. They said 3 future directions could make education more evidence-based whilst taking the objections against evidence-based education into account. Number 1, study local factors, mechanisms and implementation fidelity in randomized controlled trials. Number 2, utilize and improve the available longitudinal performance data. And number 3, use integrated interventions and outcome measures. Now, another study by Bonopov and colleagues in 2023 looked at this idea across UK classrooms, over 60 schools, and they looked at the impact of evidence-based education on the end user, the student, and their academic achievement outcomes. And they did see a connection between the evidence-based practice and the improvement in pupil outcomes. However, importantly, it was mediated by the organisational trust climate. So if we saw teachers and colleagues trusting one another in a particular school and organisation, that in itself improves the probability that there's going to be an evidence-based implementation culture, where they're taking the evidence and implementing it in the classroom, and that in itself leads to the downstream impact that we want, which is an impact on improving student learning and academic achievement. And of course, we can't look past the Monash Q project, which I talked about before. They found some excellent clues in their survey data. They found that teachers prefer research that is interactive and relational, so they can build relationships around this community of practice that are engaging with evidence-based education, that are short in format, so less than 4 pages long as an example of a written report. Original forms, so they like to get to know the original data rather than having a few different layers of unoriginal research where somebody's interpreting someone else's interpretation of someone else's interpretation and a few degrees removed. They want the original research. They want it to be usable, instantly usable and contextually relevant, practical and convenient. They need it to be perceived as credible, so coming from an expert or authority in the field, someone who's successfully implemented it and can model that. And more likely to trust research coming from colleagues, professional learning networks and school leaders rather than academics and people who are sitting in the ivory towers telling them what to do. They're also more likely to use research that is used in a collaborative manner so that they're not on their own when they're trying to implement complex evidence and translate it into practice. They're doing it as a team and they're helping one another as they go. And of course, I'm going to give myself a shameless plug here and refer to some of the research I did for the department a few years ago that talked about the 8 A's. That is awareness, attitudes, adeptness, access, assistance, advance, accountability and advocacy, and how these things need to permeate all the layers of the implementation process, right from initial teacher education with the pre-service teachers, professional practicing educators, leadership in schools, and of course the government and policy framework that supports them. Let's get behind them and support our educators in what they're doing, because everyone wins when we have a healthy, thriving education system. Now we've finally got to the point you've all been waiting for, of course, the answers to our 12 Neuromyths questions. Here they are on screen. Now of course you can pause if you want to take a closer look at that and give yourself a score out of 12. So let's summarize what we've learned as we bring this episode to a close. The first thing we looked into was, what is the research practice divide? Then we looked at why it exists in the first place. Then we shifted gears and looked at implementation science to help us understand the enablers and the barriers in implementing evidence in education. Now, just one word of caution, the field of implementation science is fairly young when it comes to the educational sector, so it's not that robust yet. So we may have to wait a few years before we can have confident conclusions about what works and what does not work when it comes to enablers and barriers to evidence-based education. Now that brings this episode to a close. Next time we're going to be looking at teaching hacks backed by the evidence, and hopefully that's going to mean you're going to walk away from that episode with a whole lot of extra practical tools supported by the science of learning for you to implement in your educational setting. Well, thank you so much for watching. If you got value out of this episode, please hit the thumbs up. And if you don't want to miss out on future sessions like this, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you.